This is part 2 of the recorded lectures for Introduction to Biology, which goes along with Unit 1. Let me get the slideshow going. We left off with prokaryotic cells, so now we're going to talk about eukaryotic cells. So just as a reminder, there are two different types of cells, only two different types of cells. There are prokaryotic cells, which do not have a nucleus, and then there are eukaryotic cells, which have a nucleus and membrane-bound organelles. So eukaryotic cells are found in plants, animals, fungi, algae, and protozoans, protozoans are larger than bacteria. They're still single-celled organisms, but they're larger than bacteria. So there's a large variety of eukaryotic cells. As it says here, they're typically larger than a prokaryotic cell, much larger than a prokaryotic cell. They have a true nucleus, which is the actual meaning of eukaryotic, true nucleus. And that means that the DNA is surrounded by a membrane. It's actually a double membrane called the nuclear envelope. So in a prokaryotic cell, the DNA is not surrounded by a membrane. It's located in a region called the nucleoid. But in a eukaryotic cell, there is an actual nucleus surrounding the DNA. Okay, and there are other membrane-bound organelles, which we will discuss. Organelles like mitochondria, the Golgi complex, lysosomes. All of these are organelles bound by that are composed of a phospholipid bilayer membrane on the outside, similar to the plasma membrane. And this just shows you some relative sizes so that you can kind of get in your mind how big some of these structures are that we're learning about. So let's just talk about first prokaryotic cells. So in comparison to eukaryotic. So what we're looking at here in the middle of the chart is a plant cell and an animal cell. And we can see both of those on a light microscope. We can see them well enough to see the cell, the shape of the cell, to locate the nucleus and some of the larger organelles. So we can see these under a light microscope on a power of 10. It says down below that they're somewhere between 10 and 100 micrometers. So this is the size of typical plant and animal cells, although there are some that can be larger for sure. A human egg cell is much larger than a typical animal cell. And then our nerve cells, we have some really, really large nerve cells and muscle cells. But anyway, inside of the plant cell and the animal cell, you can find a structure called a mitochondria. This is a membrane-bound organelle that produces ATP, which is the molecule that our cells use for energy. So there's a mitochondria in the animal cell, here's one in the plant cell. And you can see that the mitochondria is around 1 micrometer in size. And so is a bacteria, which is a prokaryotic cell. So what we have is basically a prokaryotic cell can be anywhere from 1/10 to 1/100th of the size of a typical eukaryotic cell. So you can tell if you look at the mitochondria in the animal cell, this is about how big a typical bacterium is compared to your typical animal cell. And then viruses are way, way smaller. When you look at this picture, you have to remember these numbers. A nanometer is much smaller than a micrometer. So basically, a virus would be smaller than, if you were looking at a virus on a bacterium, it would be smaller than one of those little hairs, the pili that you see coming out from the bacteria. I'm having to get my charger, sorry. Okay. All right, so I don't really care about you knowing the actual sizes of everything, but the comparing the sizes, understanding that a prokaryotic cell is as small as a mitochondria in a eukaryotic cell, and understanding that a virus can be as small as one of the individual fimbriae. I was looking for the word a while ago. I called it a pilus. I'm sorry. These individual little spikes on the outside are fimbriae, and they help the bacteria to attach to surfaces. So a virus is going to be probably even smaller than that, or about the same size as that, to a bacteria. You would not be able to see, you can see a bacteria on the high power of a microscope. You cannot see a virus under the light microscope. You must have an electron microscope. Okay, now we have a section on biodiversity. Biodiversity refers to the variety of life and its processes. It refers to variety as far as the variety among different living organisms and the variety within populations. So you can see some variety down here for sure, because we have some flowering plants. We have here a fern plant. And of course, we got a parakeet. And then we have trees, which look like pine trees to me. I'm not sure. But anyway, we've got trees, we've got fish, we've got insects, reptiles, mushrooms, and of course here's a tiger, which would be a mammal. This shows a lot of variety of, within the living things. And it doesn't show any bacteria, but bacteria would be included. And this is just a little bit of information that I pulled about why it's important that we are losing biodiversity. You often hear that we are losing biodiversity around the world at an alarming rate. So we have one thing that happens is introduced species from around the world are decimating local plants and animals. We call these introduced species invasive species. And one that you may have heard about that's very common is kudzu. Kudzu is very difficult to get rid of. It came from originally from Japan, and in Japan it does not take over plant populations. But because it has no natural predators over here in America, it can destroy trees. It can destroy other plants by just growing out of control, to where they end up kind of smothering the other plants. Kudzu is a vine, so if you've never seen it, you can Google it. It's very common. I'm sure you have seen it. You just may not have known what you were looking at, but it's very, very common. Very difficult to get rid of. Another invasive species that I can tell you about, because my family we fish a lot, and we fish freshwater and we fish in the ocean, and we have got some friends in Florida, so sometimes we will go to Florida, and we are planning a fishing trip there because the last time we went, we found that Florida has no limits. I don't, if you've ever fished before, you understand this, that North Carolina has some pretty strict limits on how many of each type of fish that you can keep, and some pretty high fines that you have to pay if you keep too many of the wrong kind of fish. So you always have to keep up with the laws. But there are these fish in Florida called Oscars, and they are invasive species. They're actually a nuisance in Florida. So they're glad for you to come and catch as many as you want and take as many as you want home. So we are going to go with some coolers, and we're planning a trip for the summer, hopefully, just to go and fish for those Oscars, which are invasive species. Okay, so there's good and bad about invasive species, but mostly I would say that it's bad. You know, um, habitat loss is decreasing as far as in the amount of available land because we're destroying, our rainforest, for example, um, to use for agriculture and other things. Um, Diseases like avian malaria, avian means bird, so avian malaria in Hawaii is killing local birds. And there is a fungus called a chytrid in the neotropics that is devastating amphibian populations. If you don't know what the neotropics are, it's really, really happening to a large degree in Africa. But the question still remains, why is this important? One reason is purely aesthetic. It's, we like to keep all of our different species because they're not all pretty, but they're pretty in their own way. Even the ugly ones. For example, when we go fishing at the coast, I do not like lizard fish, and I don't like those. I think they're called toadfish, but they're both really ugly, and especially the lizard fish. Once you catch them, you have to throw them back because you can't eat them, and they're ugly, and ugh, I just don't like to look at them. But everything is beautiful in its own way in nature. I mean, we can find beauty in all of our living creatures, but that is not the most important reason. It's just one reason. Another reason that is important is we get a lot of our medicines straight from nature. We don't use penicillin as much anymore, but we found that because it comes from the penicillium fungus. And there are many, many, many medications that we get straight from nature. Um, and we don't even know all of them yet. So a lot of our food comes from nature, and then there's a lot of interactions between species. So maybe we don't understand why a species is so important, but if it ever goes extinct, then we find out because it leads to other populations either going up way too much or going down. We don't find out why they're important sometimes until they're gone already. All right, so looking at this is a phylogenetic tree that shows you there are two different phylogenetic trees. One's unrooted. This one on the right is unrooted, and it's in a circle shape. I like this one on the left, the rooted phylogenetic tree, because what you can tell from that is that black bar at the bottom, the trunk of the tree, represents the first living cell, the very first living thing. And so that's the ancestor to all the other living things that we have that in existence. And that original ancestor diverged into the ancestor of all the bacteria, and then the ancestor of the archaea and the eukarya. And then the ancestor of the archaea and the eukarya diverged into the archaea and the eukarya. And the archaea and the bacteria are prokaryotic, and the eukarya all have eukaryotic cells. So these are the three domains of life. We have bacteria and archaea, which are both unicellular prokaryotes, and then we have eukarya, which they can be unicellular, but most are multicellular, and they're eukaryotic. They do have a true nucleus. And I do want you to understand that the original ancestor of all living things, diverged into two different branches. One is the ancestor to all the bacteria, The other is the ancestor to the archaea and eukarya. So if I were to ask you which is more closely related, it's archaea and eukarya.